Hello, and welcome to the Ask Us Anything podcast here at Center Grace Church. We're back. Listeners, you're back, and guess who's back?
I'm back.
Back again.
I'm back again.
Derek. Pastor Derek is back from his sabbatical, and we're going to do something a little bit differently this week. Instead of going through questions on Nephilim and Noah and flood and all those things, we're going to get a little recap from Derek on how his time was.
Sounds
So
great.
before we dig into your experience, can you recap a little bit like what is a sabbatical? And I had two questions on that. Is it related to Sabbath?
Mm.
Because it sounds like the same word.
Yep.
Sabbath, sabbatical.
Yep.
There's just like a tickle. That's the only
Yep.
difference.
Yep.
And my only other question with that is it commanded to
Mm.
take a sabbatical?
Yeah. Great question. So, hey, good to see everybody, or well, to be back. And it was a great time away. I'll get into some of the things that we did in a little bit. But to your questions, Matt. So a Sabbath, the concept in and of itself, it's actually found all over Scripture, and it is related to sabbatical and Sabbath are related.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same root word, and the original kind of command, so it is commanded.
Sabbath or sabbatical or
Sabbath is
both?
certainly commanded,
Yeah.
and actually sabbatical is as well.
Interesting.
So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, and kind of how the Jews did and didn't practice that,
Mm-hmm.
and even its different manifestations. But so you probably know that the original command is actually the fourth of the Ten Commandments,
Mm-hmm.
to honor the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And the root of Shabbat, it's actually or Sabbath. It's actually it just. I've heard a number of people say that you can translate it as stop,
Mm.
or just rest. And you could probably go either way with the translation, but it essentially just means stop doing what you're used to doing,
Yeah.
and enter into a season of rest. And so again, in the fourth commandment, God commands his people to remember the Sabbath day, which it's also related to. The word is related to the word for seven,
Mm-hmm.
the Hebrew word for seven. So it's the seventh day. Um, and God commanded them to remember the Sabbath day. And if you remember in Exodus, the commandment is tied, in Exodus 20, it's tied to creation. So God created for 6 days, and then he worked, or he rested on the seventh. And so again, you kind of see the play on words there. The Hebrew word for seven sounds like it's got the same kind of root as Sabbath,
Mm-hmm.
or Shabbat. And so in Exodus, it's tied to the creation. But then in Deuteronomy, when the law is actually given the second time, God also ties the command to rest or to stop, on the seventh day in particular. He ties it to God having led his people out of Egypt.
Hmm.
So there, God says essentially, you toiled and worked for 430 years in Egypt, and now that I've brought you out of your slavery, I want you to keep the Sabbath. It's a day that's set apart as holy. It's a day that you need, and you actually see Jesus pick this up in like in Mark 2. If you remember the story where Jesus and his disciples are walking through the grain
Yeah.
fields, and they're picking heads of wheat on the Sabbath, and some Pharisees see them, and they're like, "Hey, why are you guys doing what's unlawful?" Um, the Pharisees had put, by some estimations, some 600 specific laws around what it means to keep or to practice the Sabbath and to break it.
Mm-hmm.
So they took it really serious, the Pharisees did. But Jesus, the way that he frames the Sabbath command that I think the Pharisees got wrong, he said, essentially, you don't make the Sabbath holy by what you do or don't do. I've already made it holy, and it's a gift that's been made for you.
Mm.
So that's where Jesus, I'm just paraphrasing or kind of giving a little interpretation of when Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
Mm.
So I think what Jesus is kind of getting at there is like, you need this. You need a season of rest. You need a day of rest, 1 in 7. It is essential for who you are as those who are created in the image of God. You need it because you've toiled. for a long period of time, whether that's 6 days of work
Yeah.
or 430 years of slavery. You also need it because you're created in the image of God, who created in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And it wasn't because God was tired, right? It was because God was celebrating all that he had made,
Mhm.
and and so he put down his work and he just delighted in what he had made on the seventh day, and that is what we're to practice every week. Which again, in our tradition, we would also include within how do you keep the Sabbath, and essentially just we would say kind of two things. One is public worship,
Mhm.
get together with God's people and celebrate God, give Him praise corporately, sit under the teaching of God's word. So that's one of the ways that you practice Sabbath. And then the other way is just stop, rest, don't work, allow your body and your mind to kind of lie fallow, so to
Mhm.
speak, which actually then brings me into kind of the way that the Jews did and didn't practice the Sabbath, and the way that this gets manifested. So the idea of a Sabbath originally started with 1 day in seven, but then the idea or the concept of sabbatical flowed out of that, because actually um, in Leviticus, every 7 years,
Mhm.
you were supposed to allow the ground to lie fallow.
Is that the year of Jubilee,
So that
or is
actually
that different?
is the 49th year. It's the
Okay.
Sabbath of Sabbath. So
Ooh.
good question though. But so you can extrapolate or kind of the way that you see this manifest itself or multiply out. 1 day in seven, take a Sabbath.
Mhm.
1 year in seven, take a Sabbath. Let the ground lie fallow, and you practice a sabbatical year.
Hmm.
And so what God had promised was, I don't want the land to be overused. And so in the sixth year, God's promise was, I will make sure that in the sixth year, the ground will produce enough crop to where it will provide for you in the seventh.
Hmm.
And the Jews never really practiced that.
Mhm.
They also didn't do a great job of practicing Sabbath,
Ah.
just by the way. You can see that actually in the days of Nehemiah. Like there's this one moment toward the end of Nehemiah where Nehemiah's come back in. If you remember the story, they've rebuilt the walls.
Mhm.
Jerusalem's being resettled, and they're trying to follow the law. And Nehemiah sees a bunch of people like buying and selling on the Sabbath,
Mhm.
and he literally just goes off. He starts beating people actually, which don't recommend that. But the Jews didn't practice the Sabbath day
Mhm.
as well as they should have. They didn't really practice the sabbatical year. But then actually the year of Jubilee, in the 49th year, so a Sabbath of Sabbaths,
Mhm.
so to speak, the thing that was to be practiced then, and also actually in the seventh year, um, some of the other things that happened in the sabbatical year, all debts were to be forgiven.
Mhm.
So like a little student loan forgiveness, I guess, like a little tie
Mhm.
in there. Just kidding. Totally different motive and
So you're
stuff like
saying
that.
it's biblical.
I'm not saying it's biblical. Actually, I was just trying to give you an example. Totally different motive: student loan forgiveness and the sabbatical year, the year of Jubilee. But like those were some of the other things. Debts were to be forgiven. Slaves, anyone who was enslaved was to be set free
Mhm.
in the year of Jubilee. Um, and a lot of the things that were practiced in the sabbatical year were practiced again in the year of Jubilee.
Mhm.
But that's kind of where this whole concept comes from. It originates with the Sabbath day. It gets then extrapolated or multiplied out into the sabbatical year in the Old Testament, and then the year of Jubilee. And actually, if you want to, get some biblical theology going, um, a lot of people actually look at new creation as the year of Jubilee,
Mhm.
because the year of Jubilee, at least in terms of most people's reading of the Old Testament, was never practiced.
Mhm.
And so, like when you get into Daniel and got all those weird numbers that are
Yeah.
happening, and stuff like that, 7 times 7, all of those different things. It's actually the assumption in terms of biblical theology is that when the Son of Man returns, that will be the year of
Mm.
Jubilee. And so rather than worrying about like, is it a literal, 490 year or whatever,
Yeah.
that's not the point. The point is it's the year of Jubilee.
Yeah.
All things will be made the way that they're supposed to.
Do you know, do Orthodox Jews know, like, oh, it's coming up in 12 years, the year of Jubilee? Like, is
That's
that
a
a thing?
that's a good question. I think I mean, certainly they would keep their calendar such that yes, they would know when that is.
Mm-hmm.
But most of even the Orthodox Jews would try to zoom out and think about, okay, what's that going to look like spiritually?
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea of I'm not going to work for a year or whatever,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
we're not planting crops for a year. I mean, honestly, no one would dare actually live by that much faith,
Huh.
um, unfortunately. So anyway, now kind of like zooming back in, where does the idea of a Sabbath come from? Um, for like pastors, it's built upon that same concept
Mm-hmm.
of a Sabbath day, the sabbatical year. Though, again, most churches tend to try to give a pastor a season off. So, like I had 3 months.
Yeah.
The elders of the church actually agreed very graciously to give me 3 years off, and um,
3 months. Yeah.
3 months, yeah, not 3 years, 3 months. Maybe a Freudian slip there. I'm just kidding. I could not work for 3 years. But that idea gets kind of applied,
Yeah.
for pastors oftentimes, and actually, so my brother's a professor at a college, a university, and his university actually gives
Yeah.
Sabbaths.
That's what I feel like academia is the only it's the main area where it's been
Yeah,
adopted, although it's been adopted in work cultures now as well.
I've heard that. Yeah.
At my last company, I used to work for HubSpot, marketing software
Okay.
company in Cambridge, and every fifth year it was required you take, I think it was a month off,
That's awesome.
and they gave you money that had to go towards like an activity or a vacation.
Dude, I
You
love
couldn't
that.
just pocket it or put it in your retirement fund. They're like, no, no,
Right.
no, this has to go towards
Gosh,
doing something.
that's so healthy.
And then people would they document the different things they did kind of on the internal wiki and
Okay.
share their experiences and stuff like that.
That is awesome. I actually, I mean, this is so just for perspective, this is my 15th year of ministry. I've never had a sabbatical before.
Hmm.
And part of that was because, my first 8 years, I was an associate pastor
Mm.
at a church up the road in Ipswich. And then we spent the last 7 kind of planting
Yeah.
or getting Center Grace off the ground. Um, But my goodness, man, if every 5 years
Yeah.
or something like that, I feel like it is a needed rhythm. Like it's truly, as those who are created in the image of God, there is something that is incredibly restorative
Hmm.
to having dedicated time off like that.
Yeah.
And it's good to hear that in the industry, in the marketplace, some companies are starting to do that. I hope more and more do because I
I th-
think
yeah.
it's healthy.
I think they're just realizing it's like, yeah, the wisdom in it.
Yeah.
Did you have now getting to your actual experience? Did you have
Yeah.
any specific goals going into your sabbatical, or
Yeah.
how'd
Yeah,
it
I
go?
I did. Yeah, no, great question. And I feel like I'm still doing some reflection because literally yesterday was my first day back.
I know. I thought you were back. Nathaniel was like, "Oh, he'll be back." So I was like, "Okay, he'll be here on Sunday." You weren't there on Sunday, and then I emailed you on Monday, and I still got the auto reply, and I'm like,
Yeah.
"Okay, copy that email, send it to Tuesday morning at 8 a.m."
Yeah. And if you, by the way, if you did email me during my sabbatical, I did not check my email. Like I just
That.
copied or deleted and threw everything out. So please email me again if I
Hmm.
missed it. I'm not trying to ghost you or whatever. It's just I was off and I was trying to,
Your auto reply said that.
yeah.
So
So, yes, I did have some goals for sabbatical. So I have a mentor who I've been kind of being mentored by for the last, I guess, really since 2018. So probably the last 5 years. And in the lead up to my sabbatical, he gave me kind of 3 R's
hmm.
to think about them. One was just rest. He told me make a list of all the things that you're putting down,
Mm.
that you're stopping, going back to the root of the word Sabbath, stop, rest. So I did that, made a list of those things, and I didn't like checking email, preaching sermons, things like that. Didn't do any of that over sabbatical. Um, I also made a list of things that would just kind of be recreative or recreational
Mm-hmm.
for me and my family. We did a ton of hiking. We were out in Colorado for about 3.5 weeks visiting family. My brother and his wife have a place out there, and then Brooke's brother and sister-in-law have a place as well. So we got a chance to connect with them and just be in the mountains and
That's
all that
awesome.
stuff, which was great. Our boys did a soccer camp out in the Denver area, which was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And and then the other R, so rest, recreate or recreate, and then the third one was restore. And so I read some books, but my mentor even told me, he's like, I love to read, as you can see. He told me, you need to maybe pick like 3 or 4 books. Don't make a list of like 10 that you're going to
Yeah.
try to blow through. And I actually didn't get through all my books because I was spending more time hiking and
Good.
yeah, hanging out with my family. But the books that I did read were really good. Learned some amazing things, and I feel like I'm gonna be able to live on some of the water and nourishment, so to speak, that has come from that. Studied the life of Jacob. Just felt like that was one of the things that God was calling me to study
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning of my sabbatical. So I took the better part of a month to just study the story of the narrative of Jacob in Genesis, and then spent a ton of time in Romans 8,
Hmm.
just trying to get that into my heart and soul. And that's what we as a family kind of spent a lot of our conversations, devotional conversations in Romans 8 during our time as well. So
I'm.
those were some of my goals. And then the other one
Mm-hmm.
that isn't an R, but it sounds like it starts with an R,
If
is
you have the
write.
if you have the right accent.
Yeah, I had to do some writing because I'm working on my doctorate, my DMin in leadership and changing church cultures,
Mm-hmm.
and so I wrote a rough draft of my dissertation during the first probably, and I didn't like start from scratch, so like this isn't that impressive, but like I wrote the 5 chapters um, of uh, of my dissertation for
Mm-hmm.
the first part of my sabbatical. My goal was to finish by the end of May, and I actually finished a little before that,
Mm-hmm.
which was great. So I've got my rough draft in, and I'm waiting on what I need to correct
Yeah.
from my mentor. So
I like that your mentor told you to take it easy on the books because I've heard the advice that if you work with your hands throughout the week, then
mhm.
kind of like Sabbath with
Sabbath
your
with your mind.
mind,
Yep.
and vice versa. If you're preaching and reading all week, then
Yep.
go cut some wood or something,
Yeah.
you know?
And to that, so, and by the way, that quote comes from a Jewish rabbi by the name of Abram Heschel, who
Mm,
has a book called Sabbath. And I had to read that book when I was in seminary. If you ever want just a primer on what the Sabbath is and some good nuggets from it, I don't necessarily agree with all of what he writes because, again, he doesn't view Jesus as the Messiah, but he's got some really good advice. And that's his advice. If you work with your hands, Sabbath with your mind. If you work with your mind, Sabbath with your hands. And so just being able to be out in Colorado doing a bunch of hiking. We saw a moose at one point. I've got the video on my phone to prove it,
nice.
and stuff like that. It was amazing to
How
be able to
close
do
were you?
that.
Those things are,
They're pretty
I
scary.
hear they're
So
intimidating.
they are. Our son-in-law actually got frighteningly close.
Hmm.
Like when people have seen the video that he took of the moose that he saw, they were like, "You were way too close."
Yeah.
He was literally behind a telephone pole, and it was like a baby moose,
Ooh.
and so mom was somewhere around, but he didn't see her. Um, but I'm trying to think. Probably like if you were twice as far away from me as you are right now, that's how close he was.
That's, I don't know a lot about moose, but I know
It's
that's way too
way too
close
close. Way too
because
close.
they're dangerous.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean,
and
just because they're
very
so
unpredictable.
big,
Yeah,
right?
very unpredictable. Like when I saw the video, he came back. They went out early morning to go see if they could find some moose. And when he came back and showed me the video, I honestly thought it was a fake. I thought it was animatronic when
Oh
I
my
saw it.
goodness.
He was that
Hmm.
close. We were much further away. I mean, we were like probably 300 yards
Sure.
away from the
What a lot
moose.
of people would call a
A
reasonable
reasonable
distance.
distance, yeah. So, but it was really cool. Saw some bald eagles. We did some kayaking one day. Uh, Yeah, it was just a blast. I'm actually, you probably can't tell, and I know my skin tone knows two colors, white and red,
Mm-hmm.
because I've got the blonde hair, blue eyes, got some Irish background in me.
Uh-huh.
I am actually more tan right now than I ever have been in my entire
You know
life,
what? If you
and I'm not very
if
tan.
you want me in post production, just tune that skin tone up. They'll be
Yeah,
like,
go for
man,
it.
they've
Just
been at the
dial it up.
beach.
Dial it up. Yeah. So anyway, that's some of what we did.
Yeah. On the books, any particular book stand out or any specific takeaways from the books?
Yeah, man. So the two books that I read, um, that I was actually able to finish. Um, Actually, I finished three, but I'll just give you two. One was called "Praying Like Monks and Living Like Fools,"
Hmm.
by Tyler Staton, I think is how you say his name. Um, Really good book on prayer, and gave me some really practical tools, and even just I think a new framework for the way to think about prayer. So like one of the things that he does a real good job of, like every chapter kind of builds upon itself in a helpful way. But one of the places that he starts is just with the Lord's Prayer,
Hmm.
and in one of the, I think it's probably the second or third chapter, because he does like an intro chapter and then kind of just some practical hints on how to use the book, and then he gets into the Lord's Prayer. But just the phrase "Our Father," he has a whole chapter on that. And one of the things that he mentions is that those two words, in many respects, encapsulate um, a revelation of who God is to us, who we are to Him, and then the way that we are to live to everyone else.
Hmm.
So, like the idea of it being our Father. So, God's identity, no matter what we might think of Him, or the way that we might perceive Him or the culture perceives Him today, God has revealed Himself to us, and Jesus tells us that we are to relate to Him as a loving Father.
Hmm.
That's the way that He wants to be known to us. And so that needs to shape the way that we pray, right?
Hmm.
Like, and even the way that we come to Him. Like, we don't come to Him as like, defendant to judge, right? Jesus didn't tell us to operate that way or to pray that way. He said, when you pray, pray our Father.
Hmm.
It's the way that you start. So remember that He wants to relate to you the way that a father does to his children. And that then shapes the way that we perceive ourselves to Him, right? Like, I'm a child of God. And just like, you with young kids, right? Like,
Hmm.
I mean, your kids ask you for anything,
Sure.
right? And there's really oftentimes no filter
Hmm.
with your kids. And as a parent, within reason, right? Like a lot of times we delight in giving our kids what they ask for. And this is probably even why Jesus says, if you were a father and your child asked for a loaf of bread, you wouldn't give them a stone.
Hmm.
If they asked for a fish, you wouldn't give them a serpent, right? Like God's heart delights, because He's our Father and we're His children. He delights in hearing our prayers, and so our coming to Him. But then the other thing, the third kind of piece that he has said, was that even just that phrase, "Our Father," makes us think about the way that we're to relate to other people every day,
Hmm.
um, because it's corporate. And so everyone that I come in contact with, believer or not, right, follower of Jesus or not, I need to view those people as those who are made in the image of God,
Hmm.
those who are, at least by creation, if not yet by redemption, by creation, they are my brothers or sisters. And so my treatment of them, and even my intercession for them, uh, needs to needs to be present, right? Like I need to treat them a certain way, the way that a brother and sister would treat one another in love. But then also I need to intercede on behalf of them as well. And so that's just a little nugget, from his
Hmm.
book. But the rest of the book is kind of like that.
Hmm.
And he deals with other really practical things throughout it, like how do you deal with unanswered prayer? Like what should be our perspective on that? And um, but again, like he walks through the Lord's Prayer, he walks through a number of Psalms, and kind of just tries to really practically teach us how to view prayer.
Hmm.
And to the title, "Praying Like Monks, Living Like Fools," the living like fools part is kind of like, it's the aspect of living with the expectancy of seeing God do amazing things
Mm.
in and through prayer, because he is able to do immeasurably more than all that we could ask or imagine.
Mm.
And so that's kind of that book. That was a good one. And then the other book that I would say um, was really formative and helpful was, and I'm actually not fully done with it yet, but is How to Inhabit Time by James K. Smith, which Nathaniel actually gave me before Sabbatical. And it's just been fantastic. And it actually, one of the deepest reflections that just I feel like God was doing in me, even as I was kind of over the last 3 weeks, the fear and trepidation of like, what's it going to be like when I go back? Is the church still going to, like me? And what's, am I still going to be able to do this? Like, will I be able to get the engine going again? All of those questions were kind of swirling in my mind. But um, one of the things that in the lead up to that I had really been meditating on was Psalm 1, where in particular the phrase that talks about bearing fruit in season. So
Mm.
meditating on the law of the Lord day and night, being careful to do everything that is written in it. Actually, that's Joshua 1, but um, the meditating on the Lord day and night, being like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season. And so I was meditating on that phrase, in season, and I was thinking about the fact that life happens in seasons.
Mm.
And Sabbatical was a season, and now I'm entering into the season of ministry again. And trying to just live rather than like, oh my gosh, I can't believe Sabbatical's over, just being thankful for the
Mm.
fact that I had Sabbatical and it's over,
Yeah.
right? And now I'm entering into another season. And the question that I really felt like the Lord was posing to me was, are you ready to bear fruit in season?
Hmm.
Because I was wanting to produce fruit in you during Sabbatical. You were needing to bear certain fruit during that season, and now you need to bear fruit in this season. And so I was meditating on that and just thinking about that and praying into that and thinking about how, to be quite honest, I don't necessarily like to bear fruit in season, or maybe a better way of thinking about it is I don't like to eat the fruit that is in season.
Hmm.
And we live in a culture today.
What do you mean by that?
So yeah, we live in a culture today that you can eat apples 12 months out of the year,
Okay.
right? But we all know, especially in New England,
Mm-hmm.
we know that the best time to eat apples is in the fall,
Mm-hmm.
right? But rather than eating the fruit when it's in season, we're like, well, I'll just go to Market Basket and I'll pick up some apples,
Mm-hmm.
but they're not going to be as good as they will if you go to pull them off the trees and
Mm-hmm.
eat them from Russell Orchard or wherever it is that you like to go. And so what I mean by that is, as I was reflecting on this, like, I think I ought to be able to eat whatever food or whatever fruit I want and produce whatever fruit I want whenever I want,
Yeah.
right? Um, and by the way, I'm not saying that, like, when it comes to the fruit of the Spirit, for example, that you can be like, well, it's just not the fruit,
No.
or it's not the season for kindness in my life right
Yeah.
now, so I don't have to be kind. Like, that fruit is always in season. But what I mean by that is there will be seasons of life where patience will be more required of you than
Mm-hmm.
other things, right? Because that's going to be the thing that the Lord is just going to be working into your heart and life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but usually for me, it's kind of like, nah, I'd rather focus on the things that I want to focus on. And I feel like, I want to live. Another way of maybe pulling this out of the agricultural metaphor, but I hear people talk about this in religious circles all the time, is like the mountaintop experience.
Mm-hmm.
We always want to live on the mountaintop, when in fact God is always going to lead us down into the valleys.
Hmm.
And yet a lot of times as followers of Jesus, we assume, well, if I'm following Jesus, why can't I always live on the mountaintop?
Yeah.
Why won't my life always go well, right? So like, it's the same idea of, no, I want to just bear whatever fruit I want. Like, I always want to be full of joy,
Yeah.
right? I don't want to have to learn patience. I want to just be full of joy. I want that high moment, the great experiences of the faith and stuff like that, um, rather than realizing that life and the spiritual life even happens in seasons. And so I want to be really thankful and grateful, and I am thankful and grateful for the season of sabbatical.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be, I trust that the things that God has sown in me, to use the agricultural metaphor, it will bear more fruit. There was stuff that was sown in those 3 months that I believe God is going to bring to harvest. But uh, I can't always live in a perpetual Sabbath
Mm-hmm.
or sabbatical. I can't always live on the mountaintop.
Hmm.
I can't always live in just, you know, immeasurable joy, right? There are going to be moments where I'm not as joyful. I'm going to have to be learning and practicing patience or
Yeah.
self control or gentleness or whatever, because God is going to lead me into those seasons. And if as I was meditating on these things and praying about these things, I came across in James K. Smith toward the end of his book, How to Inhabit Time. He uses the same metaphor at one point, and he is doing some reflection on the passage in Ecclesiastes.
Okay.
For everything there is a season.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
you probably know the song from the Birds, "Turn, turn, turn," right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, there's a season for everything under heaven. There's a time to plant, a time to harvest. There's a time to water, a time to
Yep.
pull up, a time to a time to die, a time to have to be born. And just realizing that that is the reality of life. But one of the things that James Smith actually was talking about, and he used the illustration of gardening in his like physically gardening, and then applies it to the spiritual life, that I just found really refreshing and helpful. And um, it coincided with a lot of my thinking. But he said that when you're getting ready to plant a garden, and they live in Michigan, so the winter is very much probably more harsh
Yeah.
there than it is even here. But said, when you're getting ready to plant, there's a lot of expectation, and when you're getting ready to harvest, there's expectation.
Mm-hmm.
The joy of being able to eat the fruit and things like that. And when you're getting ready to plant, there's the expectation of, what's the year going to be like? Are we going to have a bumper crop or whatever? And so he said that that's one of the emotions that goes with seasonal living, and recognizing seasonal living is that there's a season of expectation. But then the long period of time that oftentimes we don't like to talk about is the season of obligation.
Hmm.
It's the season of just sowing, or not sowing, but of tilling and weeding
Mm-hmm.
and tending. Um, so going back to Psalm 1, as I was thinking about this in light of Psalm 1, it's like the phrase, but day and night he meditates on the law,
Mm.
right? Like there's nothing glamorous or sexy about meditating on the law of the Lord day and night. It's not a conference experience. It's not a sabbatical. It's not any of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but that's part of seasonal living, right?
Hmm.
Is recognizing the obligation of like my spiritual rhythm now that ministry starting to kick back up and sermons have to be prepared and shepherding needs to happen and counseling appointments and weddings and funerals and all of that stuff. My own personal uh, space to
Mm-hmm.
read and think and pray, it just shrunk drastically,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that's okay,
Mm-hmm.
because this is a new season. But I'm now back in the season of obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Um, And yet I'm still expectant because God just brought me out of a season of sowing and reaping in some good ways, right?
Yeah.
But so those are some of I think, the deepest things that are going to hopefully pay real dividends, both for me, but also, Lord willing, for the church as well.
Mm-hmm.
That those things that God sowed in me, um, and my family during that time, even as Jesus says, like in John 15, when Jesus is doing teaching on abiding in Him and bearing fruit, He actually says that we should bear fruit even for the sake of others.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's one of the things that I'm really hopeful in and kind of praying into, that, Lord, what are the things that you sowed in me that as you raise a harvest, it will also really benefit the church
Mm-hmm.
as well. But that mindset of viewing life in seasons,
Mm-hmm.
um, has been a really helpful framework for me, because I don't know if you're this way, Matt, but like I find myself oftentimes like always wanting to go back,
Hmm.
like always thinking, oh, yesterday was so much greater, like, or always wanting to go forward,
Sure.
right? But
I'm more of that, but yes.
I'm struck, but whatever, like whatever perspective, and I'm probably more future oriented too.
Sure.
Um, but I always find it hard to live whatever moment of the present I'm in. I
Hmm.
find it hard to live in the present. So I was talking with a young mom yesterday, and we were just talking a little bit about this, about
Hmm.
seasons, and like if you're a parent of a young kid, you are in a season where, to be honest, and again, just try to think about allow the framework of seasonal living to really engage your mind and heart. You're in a season where you have to sow to your kid.
Hmm.
You have to. And you have to sow, to be quite honest, you have to sow more to your child than you do even at times to your marriage.
Hmm.
And that can be frustrating. It can be really disappointing. It can be hard. It's taxing, right? Like, I mean, it's exhausting. Um, it can create a lot of resentment if you're not
Sure.
recognizing, in your marriage that that's a season that you're living in. But like, how will you live in that season still with health in your marriage, but talking about those expectations of like, what's that going to mean that, we have a 18-month-old or however old your kid is at home. And I just wish, like, as I've been thinking about this, I wish somebody would have told me that, 20 years ago when we had our first,
Hmm.
uh, 21 years ago, 22 years ago now, that, hey, life happens in seasons.
Yeah.
Um, and again, the more that I've been thinking about this, so it started as I was meditating on Psalm 1 and that phrase, and then James K. Smith. But then the more that I've been thinking about it, the more I'm seeing this idea in different ways, almost everywhere
Hmm.
in Scripture. Like even in Psalm 23, right?
Hmm.
Psalm 23 is actually set up seasonally. Like if you, and I remember a long time ago reading the book A Shepherd Looks at the 23rd Psalm. But at the beginning of the psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. All of that is supposed to be set um, in the spring,
Hmm.
after the thaw, when you're still kind of at the ranch, as we
Okay.
would say in Texas.
Okay.
But then you have to be led out into kind of the more dangerous places, like in the
Hmm.
valley of the shadow of death and all that stuff. But the reason why you're doing that is because you want to go up on the heights in the summer into the fall.
Hmm.
And before the winter, you're back at the ranch. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, right? You're back at the ranch, so to speak, um, by the winter, but you have to be led through the valley of the shadow of death so that you can be up on the heights in the fall, because you ate all the food back in the
Hmm.
in the pastures in the spring, and you need it to grow so that in the winter, the sheep can have something to, so you got to lead them out,
Yeah.
and so that's a passage, the Ecclesiastes passage that James K. Smith talks about. And I mean, again, just all over the scriptures, the agricultural metaphors,
Yeah.
they have as a backdrop seasonal living.
Yeah.
And I'll just be honest, like I don't like the dry season, spiritually
Yeah.
speaking. Like I,
Yeah.
I want to always live in like just the lush.
Hmm.
I don't like winter, I don't like April and May here,
Yeah.
right? I don't like the muddy season, so to
Yeah.
speak. But just learning how to embrace that, and like, what does that look like as a family, with our kids at the ages that they are, or your kids at the ages that they are? Like, how am I going to just be thankful for whatever season it is that God has me in,
Hmm.
and remember that God is with me in that season?
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because so we have Sienna who's 3 now,
Yeah.
and we had her for 3 years, and now we're in the process of adopting Zachary who's 5.
Congratulations, by the
Yeah,
way.
thank you. And these yesterday, today, and tomorrow, he's actually with his aunt. They went up on a big trip to his biological aunt,
Okay.
or great aunt. They went up to a big, what's it, like Wolf Lodge or
Yeah, Great
something?
Wolf
Great
Lodge.
Wolf
I've heard
Lodge.
of
So
that.
they're
Yeah.
up there. They're having a blast, and whatnot.
Okay.
But now, I was talking to my wife. It's like we're time traveling. Like
Mm.
we went back into a season
Yeah.
right now. So yesterday, my wife was like, okay, I'm gonna have a date with her in the morning. You have a date with her in the afternoon. So
Right.
like me and her, we went out to like a restaurant, like a pretty nice restaurant, just
Yeah.
her and
That's
me. And
awesome.
there's like, the nice silverware and whatnot,
Yeah.
and it's just like her just chatting about everything. And
Yeah.
but it's interesting to where like you get this little moment of, oh, I remember we used to be in that season where it was the three of
Hmm.
us, and now here we are back again, and kind of like let's take advantage of
Right.
this. It's almost nostalgic, kind of
Right.
going back for that little bit of time, but it was a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I think that it's our capacity. One of the things that James K. Smith talks about throughout the book is just the need for discernment,
Mm-hmm.
but it's our capacity to discern the season that is so important,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like in that situation, being able to capitalize even on those few days
Yeah.
where it's just the three of you again, like that's huge, right? But
Yeah.
like it's and for even for Sienna, like teaching her as she grows up, um, because I don't know if she's this way, but like I can remember at various times, like our kids, when one of the older or one of the younger kids was out and there was
Yeah.
more focused time, right? It's like, I really like this,
Yeah.
can we do
Wait,
this?
wait, I remember this.
you know, and trying to teach them, like, yes, it's so good for us to be able to focus on being able to just invest in you. But again, this is a season.
Mm-hmm.
We have this opportunity. We're going to take advantage of this opportunity, but then the season's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
And are we willing to embrace and discern, what the season is? And so that again, as I'm coming back in to sabbatical or out of sabbatical into ministry and kind of the work life balance, learning the work life balance again. That's one of the things that I'm thinking about. Like rather than like, oh man, I just love to be in Colorado again.
Sure.
I can be thankful, really grateful for the time that we had as a family, um, and the things that I was able to reflect on and stuff like that. But I'm not going to be able to journal for an hour a day. Like
Sure.
I'm not going to have that time.
Yeah.
And so like even as I was talking to this young mom yesterday, I was just encouraging her. I was like, I would encourage you to think about how you can view like your week. If you want to journal or whatever, right? Like whatever it is that you really, I just want to invest more spiritually in this way or that way. Like don't set your goal so high. Like if you want to have a date night with your
Yeah.
spouse, right? Like you may not be able in this season of life to pull off once a week. Like
Mm-hmm.
you just may not,
Yeah.
right? Once a month, right? Like set your sights in a realistic place, recognizing the season, knowing that your season is going to change
Yeah.
at some point in the future. So,
Yeah. I have a quick fact for you, which
sure.
is if you go to Market Basket and you grab an apple, I think it's more likely than not that that apple is over a year old.
Are you
I
serious?
am serious.
Wow.
They coat them with wax, and then they do some sort of process to keep them from
I'm never going to
spoiling.
buy apples at
From
Market
from
Basket.
this is a Market Basket. This is just like
Everywhere.
apples. Yeah.
Right. Wow.
And if you get an apple, like get an apple, I showed this to my brother-in-laws. We're talking about this. You get a knife and just scrape the apple. Have you ever done this?
Uh-uh.
Just this may haunt you, or you may be okay with this. Take any apple, Granny Smith, take a little butter knife and just start scraping like that. You'll see wax just start accumulating all over the knife. It's
Wow.
from the apple being preserved. And then what they do when they need to sell them is they take them out, and I think they have a gas that then like ignites the ripening process and like gets them back into apple
Fascinating.
mode. But just a little fact
Fascinating.
for you.
Wow.
Question for you though. Is there anything that you are carrying over from that season into this season?
Yeah, one of the things that we as a family are really talking about is how to just make sure that we're investing in one another as a
Mm,
family. So I've told a number of people this. If I would not have gotten my dissertation done, and if I would not have read the books that I read,
yeah.
I would have still considered sabbatical a success, just by virtue of the fact that we had as much time and I think joy in
Mm,
being together as a family as we did. And so I think us trying to figure out, like we're trying to figure out our work life dynamic. Brooke's a
yeah.
teacher, I'm a pastor, and so it's a lot of times it's like all hands on deck all the time.
Yeah.
When school starts,
Yeah.
and so like one of the things that we really want to do. and our, like we were talking about this morning, like we went on a walk, like the time to connect
Mm-hmm.
as a couple. It's like we took our dog out on a walk this morning. It was more like we took him out on a drag because our dog doesn't walk all the time.
So my
Or what?
dog is dragging us,
Okay, well,
so
I'd
it's
almost
the other way
rather
around.
that, to be quite honest. But we were talking about like what's it going to look like for us as a family to really unplug once a week together.
Mm.
So that's one of the things. One of the other things, and this takes us back even maybe to the comment that you were mentioning, Matt, about companies beginning to
Mm-hmm.
institute sabbaticals for people. Like I used to be the kind of person that even if I had like whatever vacation time I had, I wouldn't take it
Yeah.
because I felt like I just needed to be there.
Yeah.
Um, no more.
Yeah.
Like I'm always going to take my vacation. And I would just say too, like, and this was one of the other things. I had a number of conversations with my brother and some other folks about just a good work-life balance, rest and
Mm-hmm.
vacation time and stuff like that. And I would just plead with you, if you're listening, and you don't take your vacation, stop it. Like
Mm-hmm.
take your vacation.
It's interesting you say that the same company that I work for, they had an unlimited vacation policy, and they
Okay.
had to amend that to be an unlimited vacation policy with a mandatory minimum of 2 weeks
Wow.
because people weren't taking vacation
Right.
with unlimited vacation.
So that's fascinating, but not surprising. So my brother, one of the things that we were talking about, so my brother lives and works in Dubai.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things, as we were talking a little bit about work-life balance, and they're professors, so they have the whole summer off, which is great, and they just really love that. Um, but we were talking a little bit about how in most European countries, evidently, my brother was telling me that when you are an entry level employee,
Mm-hmm.
you start with like 6 weeks of vacation.
Yeah, doesn't surprise me.
And they, in a lot of places in Europe, they mandate that you take 4 weeks consecutively
Hmm.
off. And then you can take your other 2 weeks whenever you want, right, throughout the year. And they usually say, and please don't stack it on your month off, right?
Yeah.
Like we would rather you take a week at Christmas and then a month off in the summer or whatever. But and then my brother gave me an article, put a link to an article, and I think the title of the article was "America, the No Vacation Nation."
Mm.
You could probably Google search that, but in the article, and I can't remember all the statistics, but it's like roughly 30% of Americans don't take all of the paid time off that they're allotted.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what the article explores, and this is just true. I mean, like
Yeah.
it's just a fact. Like in America, we exchange time for money / importance.
Hmm.
So, like what we're willing to give up time off for the sake of making more money, bonuses or
Yeah.
whatever, and or status. You know, I'm important. I can't leave. If I leave, the
Mm-hmm.
wheels will fall off, or I might be moved down the pecking order. If I take time off, I won't be able to move up the ladder, the work ladder. And again, let's go back to where we started the conversation. God created us with a need for rest,
Mm-hmm.
and He hardwired it into us. And as I was thinking about this, because like honestly, like when we were getting ready to go to Colorado, I was like, we have never been this intensely around one another 24/7 for this extended period of time ever,
Mm-hmm.
ever.
How'd the family react to that?
And honestly, I was like kind of afraid, like we didn't know, like, is there going to be like a lot of, like, are the kids going to fight a lot, or Brooke and I going to, like,
Mm-hmm.
what's it going to be like to be around each other all the time? It was awesome. And I'm not saying like that there weren't moments
Sure.
where, like we're on the drive out to Colorado that we, get bored and frustrated and all, like, yes, like all of that happened. It wasn't perfect by any means, but like, um, I think that some people are afraid to take time off because they're afraid of what it would be like to be around the people that they're supposed to love most.
Hmm.
And then that because of the work kind of imbalance, they're afraid to take that time off, and then their relationships sour. So then they don't want to take time off.
Hmm.
And so like it's just this cyclical kind of thing. And so I would just say, take your time, like go away, stop working, like. And so that's going to be one of the other things. A long answer to a short question. That's going to be one of the other things that we're just going to be committed to
Mm-hmm.
is making sure that weekly we have a good rhythm of family time, where the phones are put away. We focus just on hanging out as a family and stuff like that, practicing hospitality, having people in, stuff like that. But then when it comes time for vacation, I'm not going to be afraid to go away.
Yeah.
And when I go away, I'm not going to be afraid to turn my phone off and not
Mm-hmm.
check my email and stuff like that. I mean, you've already proved as a church, like, you guys can do this without me. It's great.
I think everyone has that sense of, I remember feeling this like going on vacation or whatnot at my last company, and everyone's like, they're gonna fall apart without
Right.
me, right? And then you
Totally.
come back and you're a little bit more humble and you're like, wait,
You
you
guys
guys
didn't miss
managed
me?
it? You
Yeah.
guys managed just to, okay.
Yeah.
Everyone has a little bit of that in them, I think.
Yeah.
It's gonna be okay.
It's going to be
And
okay.
also I think it's a good point for like employers. If you have employees who aren't taking their time off, like you need to step in
Right.
and you know, make them take their time.
Right. And again, like I would plead with you, like if you're an employer, to Matt's point, please make sure you're encouraging people to take their time off, make them take their time off. And if you're not taking your time off, please take time off. And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have to be anything huge or extravagant or expensive, right? Like do a staycation,
Mm-hmm.
but like slow mornings, make breakfast together, hang out as a family. Like those are going to be undoubtedly those are going to be some of the things that we as a family think,
Yeah,
most uh, most proudly of
yeah,
when we think about our time together.
yeah. I can't help but touch on this. You said Romans 8 was what you kind of dwelled on a lot.
Yeah,
I remember years ago, I was, looking for what scripture to memorize and whatnot. And I remember John Piper had said, if you're going to start memorizing scripture, he said, start with Romans
I
8.
would agree with that.
And because it's
100%.
like so encapsulating and so
Yeah.
rich and so it covers so much.
Yep.
So that was kind of like what you were dwelling on. What, any thoughts or takeaways from that?
Yeah. So, I mean, yes, exactly what you just said. J.I. Packer
Mm-hmm.
actually referred to Romans 8. I think it's in his book, Knowing God. He refers to Romans 8 as kind of the Everest of
Mm,
Scripture. And I would agree 100% with that. But the so I think if I were to boil it down to one thing that, and there's so much in Romans 8, but well, I mean, how do you boil it down to one thing? Like the question I think that we are all wrestling with as humans is, does God love me?
mm,
And that is where Paul lands the plane in
mm,
Romans 8. And he starts, because again, Romans 8, there's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. He begins by telling you how God could love you,
mm-hmm.
right? Like that's not the way that we typically read it. Like we're not asking necessarily that question, but Paul exposes the fact that that is really the question that you're asking by the time you get to the last part of it.
Yeah.
What shall separate us from the love of God? And he has a list:
Mm.
shall famine, shall nakedness, shall danger, shall sword,
It
persecution,
was actually referenced, I think, this last week. I thought he said it was like an Augustine quote or something, but I was like, that's Romans 8.
Hmm,
Maybe I think
okay,
Augustine was referencing or something.
probably
But yeah. Yeah,
was.
that list is pretty epic.
Yeah. And again, like we ask the same question, right? Like if suffering is happening in your life, right? So like external circumstances aren't going the way that you want. Does God love me?
Mm,
Right? Paul's answering that question, seeking to answer that question. But also internally, how can God love me if I'm as sinful as I am?
mm,
I blew it again, whatever it is that happened, right? God is telling you in Romans 8, Paul is telling you in Romans 8 as he's meditating on the gospel, God loves you, and here's how.
mm.
Um, and he starts out too, like as a family, as we were kind of going through this and unpacking, like you get through about verse 13, and it's kind of like, okay, sweet, like there's no condemnation, I'm justified through faith in Christ, that's great. God has this legal relationship with me.
Mm-hmm.
But then that's where Paul's kind of like, no. And this is where I think he makes an intentional move. He's like, it's not just that God has a legal relationship with you. It's not just that God tolerates you, that he's zeroed out your account and that he's actually put some money in your account, so to speak,
Yeah.
in terms of being justified through faith. he loves you like a son or a daughter,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like we've been given the spirit of adoption.
Mm-hmm.
You're no longer a slave to fear. Paul says you've been given the spirit of adoption, the spirit by whom we cry, Abba, Father, right? So it's taking us back to how we pray, our Father, right? Like, so there's just so much in Romans 8, but the question that Paul is answering is, does God love me?
Mm-hmm.
How can God love me? How can God love me when suffering's happening in my life? That's the last part. How can God love me when there's sin still in my life? That's the first part of Romans 8.
Yeah.
And so just being able to go on that adventure,
Awesome.
was really good.
Awesome.
So,
Last question for you. Say Nathaniel at one point will be going on sabbatical. What advice do you have for him?
uh, I would say the
Or for
biggest,
anyone,
yeah, I would say, don't go into it. Go into it with expectation for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but don't go into it again with like this huge long list. Like I'm an achiever by nature. I love having a to-do list,
Yeah.
right? And being able to check things off. Um, but I learned that I can actually thrive without having a list.
Mm.
Um, I can do it. Now that being said, I have a to-do list for this week, right?
Of course.
And I kind of have to. But like, and this is, I think, even one of the things that I want to take into my Sabbath practice, like weekly as a
Yeah.
family. When Sabbath starts, and like practically, I think one of the things we're going to try to do, and I've talked about this in the past, but we're going to try to start it at sunset and go to sunset the next
Mm-hmm.
day because that's the way the Jews understood the day.
Mm-hmm.
It starts at an evening and
So sunset on Saturday till
sunset
sunset.
on Saturday to sunset on Sunday.
That's how we do it.
Okay, that's
Mm-hmm.
awesome. And I'd be curious as to some of you guys' practices, but
Yeah.
like once sunset comes, like the to-do list it's gone.
Gonzo, yeah.
And so like that would be, I think, one of my biggest encouragements. Or like if you feel like, and I did, like I went into my sabbatical knowing that I had to get 5 chapters written for my,
Mm-hmm.
dissertation. So like I had a couple things, that it was just like I got to get this checked off.
Yeah.
But I didn't even get through all 5 books that I wanted to read. I got through 3 of them, or really 2.5. And I'm okay with it.
Awesome.
But I would just say, just take it slow, enjoy it, and man, enjoy your family. Um, and I do think that that's one of the things that it's just a number of pastors sometimes refer to. I've heard John Piper actually refer to the pastorate and the church as like it is a second family,
Mm-hmm.
right? But like the responsibilities, and it's not, not trying to toot the pastoral horn or anything like that, but it's just unique. It's different for us. And it's different for our families. Like, I mean, you ever
Sure.
thought about the fact that Brooke does not have a pastor,
Hmm.
right? Like she has me. Like if like everybody else can complain to me
That's a
about
tricky
things that are,
dynamic.
it's a really tricky dynamic. Um,
Does she ever approach you and be like, I'm a pro, like,
I want to come to you as the pastor
yeah,
right now.
like, give me your pastoral answer, then give me your answer as the
Yeah.
husband. I don't know.
No,
That's
but
a,
I mean, not usually, because she's just
she
too
can't.
kind
Yeah.
that way. But like, and I do feel like it's kind of good that now that Nathaniel's here, because hopefully in some
Yeah,
respect,
that's
I can
true.
kind of pastor his family and he can pastor my family. But it's unique. And so like when the demands that are placed upon us outside of our own family are oftentimes unique as well.
Mm-hmm.
Not saying, I mean, our elders do an amazing job, our deacons and deaconesses do an amazing job, our lay leaders do an amazing job. I'm not saying that burdens aren't put on them and that they don't lift. They lift. They do heavy lifting for sure. But there's just a uniqueness
Mm-hmm.
to the pastoral vocation. And I think sometimes our families take an unfortunate backseat
For sure.
to that. And so I would even say this, like, when to everybody who's going on vacation, like when you go on vacation, focus on your family.
Mm-hmm.
Take time to spend with your family. That would be my biggest encouragement,
Yeah.
to anybody.
At a prior church I went to, they did something really well, which was they had a team, that would check in with the pastors, but then they also had specific people that would check in with the spouses of the pastors
So
because they
good.
just recognized that, like, Brooke carries a lot just by the fact that, she's your wife,
Yep.
and things get put on her.
Yeah.
Um,
That's so good. I think that's great. And we do try to do that, like
yeah.
within the elder board and things
Hmm.
like that.
Yeah.
Shepherd one another for sure. But yeah, I think those would be my biggest pieces of advice. Focus on your family. That would be the biggest. And then, don't make yourself a huge list of things to
Yeah.
accomplish.
Awesome.
Just take it slow.
Cool. Well, we're glad to have you back.
Thanks, man. I'm glad to be back.
Are you excited for this week? Do you feel sharp or do you feel like mush? What's the brain right now?
uh,
Or
I
is
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like I feel like I was telling somebody else earlier. I know the rhythms of what it looks like to prep a sermon and
yeah.
those things. But I don't know how it's going to land come
Mm.
Sunday. So
Is it going to be like an hour and a half long
I hope
sermon,
not,
or
man. That's one of the things.
maybe you'll be
Also,
cured of this and you'll be like 35 on the
that's
dot.
what, dude. I'm praying for that.
Rich will be
I'm
rejoicing.
praying for that. I'm so praying for that. So that's one of the things I've been trying to challenge myself with too. Is I need to preach shorter sermons. It's just that you guys, I know you have a lot of good questions.
Yep.
So,
Hmm.
and I'm sure we'll talk more about Noah next week, and we'll get into all kinds of Noah stuff
For
next week.
sure. Awesome. All right, everyone. We'll see you next week. Keep sending in the questions and yeah, peace.
See you guys.